If you are like most Bible readers, and you open up the beginning of the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew or the end of the third chapter of the Gospel of Luke, you might well balk. For in both cases, you will be presented with a list of names, most of which will mean absolutely nothing to you, the ancestors of Jesus. I mean, who wants to read that? And so the temptation, if you don't just give up reading altogether at that point, is to skip all those names and, get to the good stuff, the stories and the narratives about Jesus. But that might be a mistake. Those lists actually matter to the story. And in fact, if you know how to read them, they are stories. But that's often not what people take away from those passages. Most people who read them and read them carefully just often come away with a problem they think needs to be solved. Because here's the thing. If you read these two genealogies of Jesus side by side and compare the names, they actually disagree in some very significant ways. See, both identify Joseph as the father of Jesus, or at least as the seeming father. But then they give different names for the father of Joseph. Matthew says that Joseph was the son of Jacob. Luke, that he was the son of Heli. Both agree that Jesus was descended from King David, but they then trace that descent through two different family lines. In Matthew, that lineage is traced through the line of kings that succeeded David on his throne in Jerusalem. His son Solomon, all the way through to the last king of Judah before the exile in Babylon. But in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is apparently descended from David's son Nathan, who nobody has ever heard of. Neither has anybody heard of any of the other names in between Nathan and Joseph. And that's usually where people stop. They notice, you can't help but notice, that the two accounts of the family tree of Jesus are different. And for some people that becomes a problem that they need to explain away. Because, well, both cannot be correct, right? And if one is wrong, well, doesn't that mean that the Bible contains errors? And, well, that's not acceptable to some people. And so people will try to explain it away. One of the explanations people put forward is that one of the family trees in the Gospels is the family tree of Joseph, while the other one is the family tree of Mary. Maybe you've heard that explanation before, but it's an explanation that kind of falls apart if you look at it at all closely. You see, ancient people never, and I mean never, traced genealogies through women. In fact, they didn't even think that women contributed anything to the genetics of a child. The very idea that a woman might contribute to someone's lineage was pretty much unthinkable to them. And I know, that's a very foolish way of thinking about it, but it's patriarchal thinking, and patriarchal thinking is kind of foolish. No, there's a contradiction there, and you cannot explain the contradiction away. And if you are someone who believes, as I do, that the Bible is an inspired book, inspired by God, you might conclude, or well, you have to conclude, don't you, that that contradiction is there for a reason, because there is a different and deeper truth that you need to find than could possibly be communicated through an accurate list of names. You need to find that truth. You are being invited to struggle with that contradiction and discover that deeper truth. And so that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to actually live in that contradiction a little bit. And in that contradiction, I think there's a story. And I'd like to tell you that story. It goes like this. David, the king, was dead. And as he was laid in his tomb, his sons, and he had so many sons, all gathered. But two of them stood out before the crowd. The first, of course, was his son Solomon. And everybody knew why Solomon mattered. He had already been anointed and started even to take over his father's duty before he had died. Solomon was dressed in sumptuous robes and surrounded by sycophantic courtiers. But, as splendid as he looked, Solomon was just a young man, and he probably felt pretty much out of his depth. I mean, he had barely survived a succession crisis. He wasn't entirely sure whether he would be able to hold on to the power that had been passed on to him. So that was Solomon. The other key son who was there was named Nathan. And nobody knew who Nathan was, but they understood that he mattered. And he mattered because he was the man who would be charged with the care of the tomb in which David was being laid. You see, David was being buried with his fathers, which meant that he was being placed in the tomb of Jesse, and of his father Obed, and of his father Boaz. It was also the resting place of an extraordinary woman named Ruth. And Nathan was there because that tomb rested upon a piece of land that belonged to him. You see, while Solomon would henceforth live in Jerusalem in a palace of cedar, Nathan was the son who would remain here and live on this land, the land that had sustained the family for generations, ever since the days when Joshua had given the land to the people. God had made a promise to David through a prophet. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, God had said, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And as they stood around that tomb, and as people gazed at the beauty and the wonder that was the young man Solomon, all of those present, Nathan included, had absolutely no doubt who would inherit that incredible promise. If anyone was to establish a kingdom that would last forever, it would be Solomon, the son of David and of Bathsheba. But you know what they say? What they say about power corrupting. That branch of the family, Solomon's branch, kind of went off the rails almost right away. Solomon began to believe his own propaganda. He began to use his power to exploit the people through things like forced labor. As a result, he became richer and richer and more powerful, and as that happened, he acted more and more like any other tyrant, lording it over all the people. He became a new Pharaoh. Is it any wonder, therefore, that after he died, his great kingdom split apart? The kingdom was greatly diminished, but the ruling dynasty, the house of David, endured. And it's true, It's true that some of them tried their best as rulers. They sought to reform the nation and set up systems to protect the people. But for every good king in the line of David, it seemed that one or more fell far short. The kingdom limped along. It was almost destroyed by the Assyrians. They only survived the Assyrian attacks by the grace of God. And then, sometime later, came the Babylonians, and the house of David failed the challenge of the Babylonians, made the wrong choice again and again. The final rulers of the house of David were taken away into exile, and the kingdom that was supposed to last forever, it was no more. Had the line of David failed? But wait a minute, where was that other line of David? What about the descendants of Nathan? What had they been doing all this time? Well, most likely they just remained where they were, on that same piece of land that the family had owned forever. The same land, by the way, where Ruth had met Boaz while gleaning in his fields. The same piece of land where the boy David had returned with his flocks at the end of the day. They lived there. They farmed lentils and grapes and barley. Never got rich. Never loaded it over other people. Never lorded it over other people. But they also never made disastrous alliances with other nations either. They subsisted. And it's possible, since they were not very important or noticeable, that when invaders came along, they didn't much care about Nathan's branch of the family. Maybe they weren't even caught up in the deportations into Babylon. Maybe they just maintained that connection with the land. At least we do know that a connection with that land remained generations upon generations later. In the time of Joseph, the son of Heli. Joseph remained connected to the land even though he no longer lived on it. In fact, he was living far away in a little hamlet called Nazareth in the territory of Galilee. And he didn't have any land there in Nazareth. He was just managing to get by as a day laborer, working on construction sites, building things with wood and stone. That's likely what the gospel writers mean when they call him a carpenter. That's often how people ended up when their debts and their poverty led to the loss of their ancestral farms. So, Joseph had lost contact with the land, but I suspect that had happened relatively recently, like maybe within the living memory of the family. Certainly, Joseph hadn't forgot about the land, because when he heard, in the days when Quirinius was governor of Syria, that a census was being held in Judea, Joseph decided to return there. Maybe he was intending to use the registration of the census to put a claim on his ancestral farm, reclaiming it according to the ancient biblical law of Jubilee. In any case, he seems to have taken his journey very seriously, serious enough to take along with him a young woman named Mary, to whom he was betrothed and who was expecting a child. He must have had a good reason if he was going to take her on that journey. You see, we are missing out on a great deal When we look at Luke's genealogy of Jesus, all we see is a list of unpronounceable names and a historical puzzle. Many people don't look past the obvious historical questions of how do you reconcile these two irreconcilable genealogies? Or how did Luke even know who these ancestors were, given the low literacy in Galilee at the time? But actually, these are the wrong questions. They miss the point entirely. You see, I do believe that God inspired both of these authors. And sometimes people think that the obvious conclusion you have to take from that is that whatever these gospel writers wrote, well, it therefore had to have been completely accurate. If it was inspired, it had to be accurate. But here's the thing. Accurate information is one way to communicate truth, but it's only one way. And God is free to inspire people to communicate truth in various ways. You see, genealogies in the ancient world did not work like what happens today when somebody writes down their family tree or gets an ancestry service from 23andMe. Such modern activities are completely data-driven, but ancient genealogies, they were story-driven. They were about telling the story of the past and the future of a family. And we'll never know. We'll never know how Luke got that list of names of Jesus' ancestors, at least in those generations between Heli and David. Obviously, the part after David, he got that from the Old Testament. But it actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if he got it from some written record he found, from some family lore that had been handed down by word of mouth, or if the names came from his own inspired mind. What matters is the story he is telling. And the story he's telling is about a family, a different family, and a very different kind of family than the family that Matthew was telling about. He was telling the story of a family that was tied to ancestral lands, but lost connection to those lands. He was telling the story of Jubilee, an ancient biblical law that was all about reconnecting families with the lands that they had lost. And he was telling a story that would end with Joseph returning to his ancestral home with his betrothed wives, who was about to give birth to a child. A child, of course, who would actually be the fulfillment of the promise given to David so long before. The promise that had been squandered by Solomon's line. I don't believe that Luke told the story of the family in that way because he knew that it was all historically accurate. He told it in order to communicate truth. And he knew the story was true because he had been inspired by God. That's how I understand the genealogy of Jesus that appears in the Gospel of Luke. Lord God, we praise you. We praise you for Jesus, heir of David, come to establish that eternal kingdom, but so much not like those original kings who ruled in Jerusalem. A kingdom that truly can last forever. And thank you that we can be part of such a kingdom. Amen.